Have you ever had a baby born earlier than expected? Have you had a baby in the NICU? Have you struggled to feed that baby human milk? Have you had to make tough decisions about whether or not you would keep the baby in the NICU to reach your feeding goals, or whether you would adjust those goals so you could get home earlier? Today's episode is all about feeding human milk to babies who have been born prematurely. So let's get into it.
When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
Earlier this week on episode 89, I had a guest who shared a story which she called a breastfeeding buffet because she had 3 totally different experiences with all 3 of her children. And one of her experiences included a baby that was born at 28 weeks. And it was her second child. She had a 2-year-old at home, and she produced milk for her baby in the NICU with the pump and made it to the NICU when she could in between her busy job and caring for her family at home. And it made me also think about a story from episode 25. My good friend Erin and colleague, she has 4 children, and one of those children was born prematurely, her first. And she shared her experience of really not knowing anything about human milk feeding at the time and following the advice given to her in the NICU, which even 14 years ago was outdated, but many of those practices are still used today in the NICU. And so I thought it was time to do an episode about human milk feeding as it relates to preterm babies, but it also often applies to babies that are in the NICU, even if they have not been born preterm. As a reminder, this podcast is just for informational purposes only. Anything you learn here, bring it to your healthcare providers. Have an honest and open conversation with them about your concerns. And if you don't like what they have to say to you, or if you're feeling dismissed, then it might be time to find other providers. Or if that's not possible because your baby is in a facility where they can't be moved, then just know that you are doing the best job you can in the circumstances that you have. So, to start out, we know that the first days and weeks are the most critical for health outcomes for preterm babies when it comes to whether or not they receive human milk. And so when a person has a baby prematurely, we like to come to them and say, okay, regardless of what your baby feeding goals were before you had this premature baby, here is the evidence, which is essentially that for every 10 milliliters of human milk that a baby in the NICU receives during their first 14 days of life, that is correlated to reductions in hospitalizations and specialized therapies needed for their whole first year of life. And that's according to a 2019 United States review of the research. So, if that's the case, would you like to consider providing human milk for your baby for at least the first 14 days of life or for the duration of time that they are in the NICU? And often, when presented with the data, this and other data, about the benefits of human milk feeding to premature babies, parents will say, "Yes, I do want to change my feeding plan." And I want to say that it is okay to start with small goals. It's okay to say, I would like to feed human milk for a week. I would like to feed human milk for 2 weeks, and then I'll decide from there what to do. Or I would like to feed some amount of human milk because we know that structurally, we do not have all the things in place to make it possible for all parents to be able to provide all the milk that a baby might need for the full duration of a NICU stay if they are born prematurely and will be in the hospital for weeks or months. This is never an all or nothing endeavor. If you want to create a plan that allows for some milk or for milk for a short amount of time, then you can always ask for the help of a lactation professional so that you can ramp up slowly and then easily wean off. That is something that you can think about from the beginning. Now, it is interesting to think about the culture in the United States when it comes to babies in the NICU. Because in the US, the goal is typically to gain weight. And often this is at the cost of other health measures. And so typically the providers are not considering nursing or human milk feeding from the body to be one of the primary goals. The primary goal is for the baby just to put on pounds and to take in calories. Often parents are told things like nursing is too physically stressful for babies who weigh less than 1,500 grams or 3.3 pounds, that their ability to coordinate sucking, swallowing, and breathing does not occur until 34 to 35 weeks gestation, and that babies should bottle feed before nursing because nursing is more difficult. But these are wrongly held assumptions that still stand strong in NICUs all across the United States. And research has proved these wrong. And I am getting my information from the second edition of Nancy Moorbacher's book, Breastfeeding Answers, A Guide for Helping Families. Two studies that she cites for this are one from Meyer in 1988 and Meyer and Anderson in 1987. So listen to those dates. We've known about this for a long time. And what they did was they compared nursing to bottle feeding in preemies. And the babies were about 32 weeks gestation. They weighed on average about 2.9 pounds and were 20 to 50 days old before they began nursing. Body temperature, breathing, heart rate, and transcutaneous oxygen pressure were used to measure stress. And the researchers found that nursing was less physically stressful than bottle feeding. And the smaller the babies, the greater the difference. These early studies found that preterm babies could organize sucking, swallowing, and breathing more easily during nursing than bottle feeding, and that the ability to nurse develops well before the ability to bottle feed, which makes sense. And I quoted that from Nancy Moorbacher's book. But this makes sense because we evolved to extract milk from a mammary gland. And if you compare what we do to what other places do, like Sweden, for instance, where 98% of babies start out nursing, including those babies who are in the NICU, it makes you question some of these practices that families of babies in the NICU are forced to do. So in Sweden, nursing is considered the biological norm, even for babies in the NICU. Now, I will note they have a societal structure of paid parental leave for all parents. And parents are given the space to move into the NICU and become the primary caretakers of their babies. And they're taught many of the medical procedures. And so it's a very different structure overall. And here, just like in the example of Jess, who told her story on episode 89 that just came out, she was living at her house. She had a 2-year-old to care for there. She was working because she did not have parental leave, and she had organized her life around taking 2 months off, but financially, she could not swing more than that, and now she had a baby that was going to be in the NICU for 2 months, and that is the case for so many parents. And so I'm so thankful that we do have other ways of feeding these NICU babies, given the structure that exists today. But this is a barrier to human milk feeding, that first of all, we are structured this way. And then that secondly, NICU policies are such that we push people more into bottle feeding, more into pumping exclusively around the clock, when we know that for many families, that is exhausting. Now, some prefer to do that, and I'm so glad that is an option, and they should be taught how to do that. But if families would rather begin teaching their babies how to feed from the body earlier on, there is very little evidence to suggest that they should wait for their babies to reach a certain number on the scale before they should begin teaching their babies how to do that. They can organize, suck, swallow, and breathe as early as 28 weeks gestation, 27 weeks gestation, and it varies from baby to baby. So, what they do in Sweden, for instance, is they just evaluate baby by baby. How is each baby doing? Can this individual baby latch on to mom, latch on to the parent who is feeding, and try to begin nursing? Once your baby is born preterm in the United States, typically that baby is probably going to be whisked off to the NICU for the medical interventions. And one important thing to know is that as far as milk supply goes, the best outcomes for milk supply is to begin expressing as soon as possible after delivery. So if you can begin expressing within that first hour, your likelihood of having a robust milk supply is going to increase. And then from that point on, if you can express between 8 and 12 times a day, if your goal is to have full milk supply for your baby, then you're going to be more likely to reach that goal. Definitely ask for help from lactation consultants at your birthing facility. It's sized. I have one episode about phalange sizing. I have another episode about hand expression, which can be super helpful for bringing in milk supply. And I have another episode about increasing milk supply while pumping. So all of those will be linked in the show notes. We also know that kangaroo care and skin to skin contact is really good for most preterm babies and is done in many other countries, Sweden being this prime example of really great outcomes for NICU babies, really great human milk feeding outcomes for all babies. Some of the exceptions to being able to do that kangaroo care, which is also good for your milk supply, are if your baby is less than 28 weeks gestation or born less than 750 grams. If your baby is very unstable or very sick, then they probably will remain in the isolette. If your baby is on mechanical ventilation because of a serious illness, they will probably need to remain in the isolette. If your baby is being treated with vasopressor drugs, and if your baby has a catheter in the umbilical artery, jugular, or femoral vein, or their chest or abdomen is being drained. And if your baby had surgery within the past week or underwent a major procedure within the previous 6 to 12 hours, then kangaroo care would probably not be appropriate. But otherwise, you could ask for family centered NICU care, and you could say that you would like to do kangaroo care to help regulate your baby's body temperature with your own body, to help regulate your baby's breathing, and to help bring in your own milk supply and increase your milk supply and bring in your baby's instinct to nurse. We know that nursing directly from the body in the NICU increases the likelihood of nursing at home.
Hi, I'm Kanika, and you're listening to That's Total Mom Sense, the podcast, where I interview public figures on their life lessons in parenting, legacy, and built-in sixth sense.
Hey, what's up? I'm Kelly Rowland, and you're checking out That's Total Mom Sense.
Hi, this is Chelsea Clinton, and my experience on That's Total Mom Sense was fantastic.
It's me, Bobby Brown. Can't wait to share my story.
Thank you to my guests, brand partners, community, and you for making this show possible. Episodes released every Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts. You can join my tribe by logging on to that'stotalmomsense.com and by following me on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Kanika Chadda Gupta. Now let's dive in to today's episode.
Now, there are some differences for nursing a preterm baby. Preterm babies have much smaller mouths, and the fat pads in their cheeks have not developed yet. So that decreases the effectiveness of milk transfer. They have less body fat. So that means they can get cold more easily, and that causes low blood sugar concerns. Their heart rate and breathing is less stable, and their brains are smaller, making it difficult to control their head and limbs. So, this can all make nursing a little more difficult, which means there's a little bit more of a learning curve. And so, as you're learning to feed a baby, they might just go in little short bursts and then fall asleep. And that's totally okay. And we used to advise people when you're starting out, just feed on an empty breast, quote unquote, empty. But new research is telling us that doesn't have to be the case. That if a baby can feed from a full bottle where the milk is constantly flowing, they can definitely feed from mammary glands that have milk in them because the flow is much slower and they can start practicing that nutritive sucking. And we've seen in studies that they are able to do that just fine and just start that practice pretty early on. But it is going to take practice. So, just like anything else, it could take weeks, it could take months, and just know that it's going to be baby steps as you and your baby learn this together. And that's okay. Reach out if you need help. I would love to be the person that helps support you as you're learning to feed your baby, whether that's virtually. Maybe you have a care team at the NICU, but you're worried once you go home. I would love to be the person that helps support you through that. So you can do it. And if you are wondering, why are things so vastly different in the US, even after so many years? This is one of the big barriers to human milk feeding, and I would love to have this discussion in my Milk Making Minutes community group. So join me there on Facebook, and feel free to start that discussion there. So see you there. Bye.